Hello, everybody. Welcome to the second part of our moonlit lily pad lagoon painting. So, as always, before we begin, taking a moment to light your candle and looking deeply into this beautiful flame, emptying all of your thoughts, anything that came before this moment, anything you need to do after, allowing that all to melt away in this beautiful candle flame. Setting the intention that anything that is no longer serving your highest good and your creative power will be transmuted and transformed with this beautiful element of fire. Inviting in this powerful element to work with us as we create. That while we create, should any self-doubt or judgment or attachment arise, that we can use this powerful element of fire to transform those back into love, acceptance, curiosity. And placing your candle in a safe place. And inviting in the element of air by lighting sage or incense or Palo Santo. And using this beautiful element of smoke to clear the air, smudging your painting, your paint, and yourself to invite in more room for light. And taking a moment here to close your eyes and to create your own creation bubble. Creating the bubble around you and your creative supplies, giving it a grounding cord, an upper grounding cord, and washing the frequencies of the rainbow through your creation bubble and through you. And I'm going to give you a moment here to do this on your own. And tuning into the powerful white light that you've created all around you in this creation bubble, within your body, feeling held and surrounded by the powerful frequencies of light. And tuning back into the intention that you have already infused into this painting. And feeling that in your heart, in your upper heart, and in your body. And allowing that emotion to grow as it washes down your arms into your hands. And as we begin to pour this intention with paint and with water onto this canvas. And so beginning with one of your larger brushes, a 1-inch brush, or if you have something larger, begin by taking some of your dark green and your dark blue and mixing those two colors together to make this really beautiful, deep turquoise color. And this color that you're mixing is going to really be the foundation of this painting. So feel free to mix a nice batch of it here. playing around with the amounts of green and blue and seeing what color really speaks to you. And when you found that color, loading up your brush and begin to just cover up all of the texture on your painting. So anywhere that you put your texture, just covering it with this color. And putting on enough paint to really cover it all. And if you want, you can just add straight up the blue and the green. So I just took a little bit of royal blue and added it right into this bottom portion here. Just a combination, any way you choose, using this beautiful dark blue, beautiful dark green, and covering up all your texture. And playing around with the different amounts and seeing what shade of blue and green mixed together. Which one do you like the best? Do you like it more blue or more green? And going right up into the corner, if you've put texture in your upper corners here. Just loading on the paint and covering up all this texture. And once you've covered all of your texture, we are going to work on our beautiful water reflections. So first, we are going to create some little trees and bushes in this top portion here. So with your brush already having some beautiful green and blue on there, let's bring in a little bit of our light blue. So light blue permanent and a little bit of cobalt blue, and mix those together. And I'm using my same brush that I have not cleaned. So it's kind of mixing in that dark blue and dark green into this color and creating a really pretty blue. And just begin by going on top of your horizon line here and beginning to fill in this whole top portion. And bring in a little bit of this color underneath and begin to do these downward brush strokes. So this entire water area is going to be downward brush strokes. So just doing the top of your water here, about an inch or two down from the horizon. And then also upward brush strokes here. And just gently blend this into the darker colors. And here I'm just going to take a tiny bit of white on my brush, just a small amount, and going over this top area here. This is going to be our light reflection. So bringing some of that white into the water and just doing these downward brush strokes. And it's okay if you go over top of your texture. So in this part, I'm just doing up and down brush strokes right across the texture, right into the water. And then here we're going to take a little bit more of that dark blue and dark green and bring in some of that beautiful color at the bottom, right underneath where these bushes are going to appear. And putting quite a bit of paint on your canvas here, going to blend this together. So just doing these up and down brush strokes, and again, you can go up into your top portion and go right across the texture. And here I'm going to bring a little bit of this light blue permanent and put it right into this area where I don't have any paint yet. And again, just gently, light as a feather, moving your brush in up and down motions. And bringing in a little bit more of this dark blue and dark green and going right across the bottom of the horizon line and just pulling the paint right down. Just beginning to make this beautiful water reflection here. And we're just going to leave this water part for now. So taking a little bit more of your light blue permanent and a little bit of your cobalt blue. And if you have any water on this side, just begin blending it in by doing these up and down brush strokes. And again, if you go right over top of some of your texture, that's totally fine. And if you have a little bit of a water reflection closer to your horizon line, you can take some of this color and just go straight down, making these beautiful water reflections. And then in this bottom portion, taking a little bit of your light blue permanent, and same thing, just start putting some paint where you don't have any wet paint yet, and doing these up and down brush strokes. Taking a little bit more of that blue and covering this whole bottom area. Begin blending this all in. And taking a little bit of white and starting at the bottom, so you have your reflection of your moon coming in here where there's white in your horizon. And if you can imagine the moonbeam coming right down, and where it ends at the very bottom of your painting, put a little bit of white there and just pull your brush up into the paint. Start making this a really beautiful moonlit reflection. And taking a little bit more of your dark blue and dark green and mix it into your brush. So it's going to, because you have some white on there already, it's going to lighten. But if you need to add a little bit of light blue permanent or a little more white to make this in-between color and merge this top part and the bottom part together. Very gently, light as a feather, brushing these two colors together. And at the bottom of this lily pad area here, I'm actually going to add a little bit more of this green and blue to carry this color all the way down. And again, going over top of your texture is totally fine here. And if you want to go all the way up to the bottom of your horizon line with this lighter green color, you can do that. And my paint is already drying, so at this bottom part, I'm going to put in a little more light blue permanent and just pull it up into this color. And having a little bit of this light blue permanent on your brush, it is turning into a light green. You can go to the very bottom of your horizon line and put in a tiny little highlight by just dragging your brush down. Then leaving that, so just letting all of that paint dry, all of the water and the sky. We're going to go to our lily pads. So mixing in a little bit, and still I'm using the same brush. I have not cleaned it yet. Mixing in a little bit of this beautiful dark green and dark blue together. And my intention here is to create the darkest color I can. So dark blue, dark green. And going back underneath your lily pads, so where you have your texture, where your lily pads are going to go, we're going to create a shadow. So underneath your texture, starting at the bottom portion of it, start putting in some of this dark green and dark blue. And anywhere that you may have brushed the water over top of the texture, you can put some more paint there. So I have some water going up into the texture here, so I'm just going to recreate that line by adding some dark green and dark blue and going right underneath. And redefining where the lily pads are going to go. And then using the same color, let's put some more bushes up in the upper portion. So again, I'm not cleaning my brush, I'm using the same color. And I'm going to go up into here and just lightly dab the brush, making these cool little bush shapes right across the top of this horizon here. And on both sides. And if you brushed over top of any texture on your horizon line, you can just go over it here and kind of redefine that horizon line. And so I'm just ever so gently scrubbing my brush into the texture to recover those portions. And then making these little bushes by just very gently scrubbing this color into the canvas. And if you want to go straight down a little bit into your water to serve as reflections, do it very, very gently because this paint is likely still wet. So we're just very gently going over top of this texture to redefine it. and very gently pulling it down. And then ever so lightly brushing over top of these parts, just to take out any dabs of paint or brush strokes. And if you get any paint anywhere you don't want it, you can just take your cloth and rub it out. Or sometimes I just like to use my finger. May as well get covered in paint. Okay, so here we're going to take a smaller brush and start creating some shadows for our lily pads. So I'm going to use this tiny little flat edge brush here. Get all the hairs out of it that are sticking out. And I'm going to take a little bit of this color. So I have so much on this brush still, I'm just going to take it right off the brush. But this is just the same color, the dark blue and the dark green mixed together. And here we're going to make some beautiful little lily pads. So just finding where your lily pad families are going to be living, and start by just making some gentle little lines. So these are going to be the shadow underneath the lily pads. So I'm very lightly just starting to map these in, where they're going to go. And so all of our water brush strokes are going straight down and straight up, and our lily pads are going to be going horizontal. So anywhere you have the texture is going to be a nice big family of lily pads, and the ones that we're mapping in here, kind of the little stray ones. So I'm not going to put in too many. We're just doing like the hint and the idea of lily pads. And so if you want to take some of your royal blue or ultramarine blue and go right underneath these little brush strokes that you've made to start giving this really beautiful highlight. Shadow, I mean, a low light. I'm going to put the highlights in next. These are just the little shadows underneath the lily pads. And so here, as we're waiting for this first layer to dry, I'm going to take some of my dark blue. So this is ultramarine blue, but this will work with royal blue or with primary blue, whatever dark blue you have. I'm going to load up my brush, and right under here, under the horizon line, I'm going to start putting in some blue. Create this little low light. So you'll notice that for areas that have shadows, we use cool colors. So putting in this blue is a really effective way of creating a shadow look. And I'm going to take some of my cobalt blue here and go right across the same areas and start bringing in this beautiful blue highlight. And not too much, I'm just putting in a little bit of a contrast here. And perhaps this blue wants to come right down Maybe even coming down farther right into this bottom area. And I'm actually going to grab some black. Hold on one sec. So because we are working with some beautiful dark colors, I feel like we need more of a contrast in our horizon line area. So I'm going to add a teeny tiny bit of black into my dark blue and dark green. So I'm mixing a little bit dark blue, dark green, and black. It's a really nice, rich, dark color. And I'm going to go right over top of my texture here. I'm just seeing what amount of black you need to put in to really get this contrast between the black and this dark green and dark blue you've put in. And so I'm just going right over top of the texture to give a little more contrast here. And you can even go, if you have some little rocks poking through, you can go right over top of those with this deep dark color. And feathering it up into the trees. And even if you want to put a little squiggly line in here, you get this mystical illusion of trees. And then going right over top of any of your texture in this top horizon line. And feathering it up into your trees here. And even taking a tiny, tiny amount and feathering it down. And kind of being aware that anything that is in the top of this horizon area is going to be reflected in the water. So if you're lightly feathering up, you can also lightly feather down. Give that beautiful reflection. I've totally made a muddy mess in my trees. It's such a good example. Just let it go. If you've made a little bit of a muddy mess, it's meant to be there. And we're going to go over top of it later. So letting that dry. And just sitting back for a second and seeing what wants to come through next. Let's start putting in some highlights. So I'm going to take my palette knife and taking a tiny little bit of white. I'm just going to hold this up so you can see here. So I'm just taking a tiny little bit of white on my palette and using the knife to just kind of do a little cut into the white. So you have a tiny little bit of white on the edge of your palette knife. And so taking your white and just very gently going right underneath your horizon line, make these little highlights, and you can even pull down a little bit with your palette knife. Been making these little highlights under the horizon line. You can even use your hands and just gently pull them down. So here, I'm going to let this dry for about 10 minutes, depending on what your climate is like, just to allow this layer to dry, because we're going to do a little bit of scrubbing with our brush. So making sure that your background is dry before doing this part. All right, so I've let this dry for a couple minutes, and we're going to start doing some beautiful golden highlights. So taking one of your larger brushes, this is a flat edge 1-inch brush that has been totally well loved and well used, and dipping your brush into a little bit of gold and working it into this brush. And if you have some stray hairs, you can just cut them right out. All right, so getting some gold on your brush, we're going to put in some beautiful golden highlights. So I'm going to put some highlights here in the water and kind of up along the top of the trees. So just connecting your brush to the top and pulling straight down. Really lightly, just to begin to bring in these beautiful golden highlights. And then I'm going to lightly dab across the top of my trees here and just start to scrub this gold into the tops of the trees. So I'm envisioning a beautiful full moon kind of right here, right where this crystal is. And it's sending this beautiful golden light right across the tops of these trees. And here I'm going to put a tiny bit more gold onto my brush and start by connecting my brush at the top of my painting and just lightly pull down. And this is going to grab the top of the texture, bringing highlights to the top of your horizon line. I'm going to do this all the way across the top. I'm going to pull this gold right down into the water. So it's just leaving tiny little traces of gold across the water. And also across the whole top portion here. And I'm actually going to scrub some more gold right into this whole top area. Kind of circulating your brush, kind of how we were making clouds last week. Just bringing a little bit of mist up here. I'm going to go right over top of my texture on the horizon line here, going straight up and down, right over top. And bringing in a few more highlights by just gently scrubbing your brush over the water in an up and down motion. So you can see here, it's kind of creating this highlight. And even here, I have this highlight coming all the way from the top. I'm going to extend it down into the water by just scrubbing my brush. So honestly, when it comes to, oh, I got some black here. I'm just gonna rub that out. When it comes to blending, I feel like it's so much easier to do this, to do your background and then take a color and use it quite lightly and scrub it in rather than worrying about blending wet paint. It's kind of adding layers. And for me, this is so much easier. So I'm going to take some more gold and lightly go over top of my lily pad areas. So just filling your brush with some beautiful golden paint and very, very lightly so it just catches the top of the texture, going sideways over top of your lily pad areas. It's just going to catch the texture and bring these areas out. Just ever so lightly. So I'm going to clean off my brush from the golden paint. I'm going to just pat my brush dry very lightly. So there's still some water on here. And I'm going to gently go up and down over where my highlight is. So imagining the moon is here. I'm going to put a very small amount of water right in the moon's path. This is going to be our highlight. I'm going to take a tiny bit of white. It's a very small amount of white on your brush, and connect it to the very top of your horizon line and just pull right down. So because you've put a tiny bit of water on this part, it's going to blend right in. And again, just pressing light as a feather, pulling that white paint down. And at the bottom, connecting your brush at the very bottom and just pulling up. So for the water portion, really paying attention to make sure that all of your brush strokes are up and down. And this is going to give us an illusion of really still water. And then up here, I'm just going to scrub in a little bit of white to highlight this area. I'm going to go right over into my trees to lighten these up here, to bring in this mystical look. I'm just scrubbing my brush up and down right over the trees. And anywhere you think you need another highlight, so I have a lot of white coming in here, I'm going to go straight down into the water and just lightly scrub in a little white reflection here. And if there's anywhere you want to blend your white in, you can just very lightly go over top of that area and just scrubbing your brush. So again, I find this so much easier. I'm not really blending paint into paint. I'm using water. And using this scrubbing motion with very small amount of paint. So it's kind of layering thin layers of paint. Again, rather than trying to blend one color of paint into the other color, we're just adding one color at a time. And if there's anywhere you want to lighten up your painting, by having a very small amount of white on your brush, you can just go right over top of it. So I'm going to bring in more of a highlight in the top area. So I'm going to put a little bit more white on my brush and connecting it at the top of the canvas, just pulling down ever so lightly. This is the same thing that we did last week with our waterfalls. Kind of bring in this mystical etheric look by just putting a small amount of white on your brush and then pulling it straight down. And you can do this over the whole top portion of your painting, wherever you feel it needs to go. So I'm going to take my palette knife and re-put in this highlight. So again, taking a tiny bit of white and then doing a little slice with your palette knife to get a tiny amount of white on there. And then just going again at the top of your horizon line and putting in a little more white paint, a tiny little highlight. And then what you can do if you have some more paint on your palette knife is start making some highlights across the bottom. So underneath your little lily pads. Adding in a little tiny white highlight. And so what we're going to do here is take a smaller brush. I'm going to use this one. What size are you? 5/8. So a tiny little, well, medium size flat edge top brush. And just begin to gently go over these white areas. And so these are the highlights on the water. They're going to be horizontal, so straight across. And what we can do is add in a tiny little bit of white paint into this brush. Make sure there's no hairs sticking out of it. And begin making these little tiny water reflections by just very gently back and forth, scrubbing the paint into the canvas. And I'm pressing very, very lightly to just give these little hints of water. Little water reflections. And I'm going to put a little bit more at the bottom to really give this reflection of the moon. And so I'm pressing so lightly. And you can carry this up very gently into the top portion, but keeping in mind that the closer to the bottom, the larger things are going to look, and the closer to the horizon line, it's going to be much smaller. So you don't want your white highlights to be this big at the top. They're going to be much smaller up here. So where you have your white coming down for your reflection of the moon, let's use this guy as our moon. And just creating this little white reflection all the way down. And so here I'm actually just going to do an up and down motion to bring this highlight in. I'm going to take some light blue permanent and using the same brush, mixing in a tiny bit of white. And I'm going to do the same thing under here. So I already have this blue coming in here. I'm going to go right over top of it these sideways brush strokes, bringing in a few more little highlights. And kind of merging everything down at the bottom. So in this bottom portion, I'm going to have all of my brush strokes sideways. And then adding in a tiny bit more white to really bring in some solid white at the bottom, making these beautiful little highlights. And you can even carry these over into your lily pad areas. So right underneath your shadow, you can put in a very tiny highlight. Just so ever so lightly dragging your brush side to side. And we're going to do the same thing over here, but instead of using white, we're going to gradually shift into blue. So I'm going to use cobalt blue and mixing it into the brush that I already have going here. So it's going to lighten it up a little bit. Lightening up this cobalt blue with a little bit of blue and white. And going right underneath the lily pads here, just doing some little sideways brush strokes. Bring in this illusion of the water rippling. And so I'm really taking my time here and adding very little paint. Maybe bringing some blue into this area. And then taking some more cobalt blue and merging it, doing some tiny little brush strokes here. And we're going right up underneath the horizon line to just add a very small amount of blue up there. And maybe a tiny bit over here to just balance it out. It's a very small amount. And if you want to add some more highlights in this area, I'm just going to do, well, there we go. I put way too much paint. So I'll show you what to do here if you put too much paint on there. Just take your cloth and adding in a little bit of water. And very gently, just sideways, going across this paint. And you can even kind of carry this down so it's ever so light. These tiny, very, very light strokes of paint being brought across. It's such a perfect example of how the mistake ends up working. Have these little light sideways strokes now. There we go. So let's work on our lily pads. So I'm going to use this brush here, just a round top brush. I'm going to mix in a light green. So taking some gold and taking a little bit of your dark green, your hooker's green, mixing it in to the gold to make this really luscious light green color. And I'm just going to start going over top of my textured areas. Actually, I need a little more gold in here. Mixing a nice green And so these are just going to be our little highlights. So I'm going to do tiny little strokes here and going over top of our lily pads. So for example, this lily pad here, I'm going to leave the bottom portion dark, and I'm going to just put a little light highlight on the top edge of it. So wherever you've put any dark brush strokes for your lily pads, just giving it a nice little highlight across the top. And I'm not getting too fussy about the details of the lily pads. I really want this to be like a dream realm, a mystical realm, where you can kind of get the idea of what's there, but there's so much mystery. And if you want to create some more lily pads, you can do that by just adding in some little brush strokes and just seeing if these need to have a darker shadow underneath. Maybe they don't. They just want to play into this illusion of water that we've created here. You can even lightly carry this up into the top areas. Maybe right underneath your horizon line. Serve as some little highlights up here. And on this side. And here what I'm going to do is bring in some gold. I'll leave my brush there for a sec. And taking my palette knife, I'm going to put a tiny bit, excuse me, of gold on my palette knife here, and I'm just going to lightly touch the top of these lily pads. Just very lightly dragging the palette knife across the top. Just allowing this gold to put these tiny little marks that serve, they're just so beautiful. And even if you want to take a little more gold and go over top of the texture here, catch some little highlights of gold. I'm just playing around with it. Oh, I'm going to put a little bit of gold across the bottom of my horizon line up here. So right where you have the bottom of your texture, just to touch ever so lightly with your gold. And bring a little more definition to the top. And if there's too much, you can just use your finger to bring it down. And even maybe a tiny bit up here. Just ever so lightly. And I'm going to do the same thing with a little bit of white. So putting a teeny tiny bit of white on the edge of your palette knife. I'm going to re-highlight this top part here and just very gently drag it down. And then using a little bit of this white to go across the bottom. Kind of bring in these little white highlights. And so you can see that it's kind of just catching the top of the canvas, creating these little sparkles. And again, if there's more paint than you want on there, you can just take your wet cloth and just drag it down or drag it across. Look at that, it's looking beautiful. So here, let's put a little bit of color into our lily pads. So actually, while I still have this brush available, I'm going to put a teeny tiny bit of green and gold in this bottom portion just to lighten it up. Realize this bottom area is really dark. Here we go. Okay, so taking a small brush to make some little lily pad flowers. Let's put some lilies in here. So I'm going to make some pink ones. I'm going to take a tiny bit of my red, a little bit of magenta, and using a small brush, I'm just going to lightly dab where these little lily pad flowers are going to go. So right on top of the lily pad, just lightly dab in a little bit of red. You can use purple, and of any color you want. And I'm not going to do too many. I really want this to be kind of an illusion. So I'm not too worried about details. I'm just dabbing the brush onto the canvas. And then here I'm going to take a little bit of white and mix it into this red. And just dab it right on top. Give these flowers little highlights. And adding in a little bit more white if you need to. It's going right over top of the little lily flowers. And there we go. So I'm not doing too many. And if you want to put some lily pad flowers in your darker area, you can actually just use one of your darker colors. So I'm going to take some red and some violet, and this lily flower is going to be a little bit darker. And I'm going to do the same thing that we did with the lily pads with the palette knife. So just taking your palette knife and adding a teeny tiny bit of gold on the very tip of your palette knife. Even less than that, just a tiny, tiny little touch. I'm going to dab right over top of my flowers. So again, this is like a way to make them look more abstract. So you're getting the idea, the illusion of lily pads and flowers, but they're so subtle, mystical, and dreamlike. Oh, and while we have the palette knife, let's take a little bit of this cobalt blue on the edge of your knife and go right underneath the horizon line here and bring in some more of this beautiful blue. Ah, that's so pretty. The highlights that are in the shadowed areas. And here, so I have this whole dark section here and I really want to lighten it up. So I'm going to use some of this blue. And instead of using a knife, I'm actually going to use a brush here. So taking one of your flat edge brushes and just putting in a tiny bit of cobalt blue into your brush, I'm just going to lightly drag over top of the texture down here to kind of highlight it a little bit. Make it a bit lighter. And I'm going to do this up here too. So we have this beautiful blue coming down. I'm going to add some of this cobalt blue to the top portion here to serve as the blue reflection. I'm just scrubbing a tiny bit into the canvas. And let's add our moon. So you have a couple of options here. So just taking a moment to look at your painting and see if there even wants to be a moon here. You can put a moon right into your painting. You can have just a reflection of a moon. And I think I might do just a reflection. So taking one of your smaller brushes, preferably a round brush, will be much easier to make a circle. So I'm taking a small brush and getting some white on there. I'm going to have my moon here and have the reflection right in the water. So I'm just going to put a nice moon reflection here. And I've put so much paint on, I'm just going to lightly dab it out with my finger. And then I'm going to make these tiny little sideways strokes, as if the water is moving here. And I'm just using my finger to kind of blend those in nicely. Finger is the best blender. I'm just bringing a little more white down here. And then you can also have your moon in the sky or have just the reflection. So I'm actually going to put my moon in here, I think. And I'm going to put some white all around it to kind of blend the moon in. I'm going to take a larger brush and put a little more white onto this and just drag the white down over top of the moon. And then cleaning off your brush of any excess paint, and then just very lightly scrubbing in the edges wherever you put your white. And just very lightly blend that in. And I have a tiny bit of white left on this brush. I'm just going to very gently do some sideways strokes here. Bring more of this effect of a little bit of breeze on the water. So this water is so still. There's a little bit of breeze here. And then if you've done a little bit too much, you can just do very gentle brush strokes up and down to kind of scrub them in. I'm going to put a tiny bit more gold across this top part here. So using that same brush, put this here so you can actually see. I'm just going to put a teeny tiny bit of gold into this brush and kind of go back over top of these trees here, these little bushes. And just lightly dabbing where the moonlight is hitting the bushes. And then even doing that same motion of scrubbing up and down. And any little gold reflections in the water by just dragging your brush down. And I think we are done. I think that completes our painting. I'm actually going to just put one more little highlight here. It's like such a fine line. When you know you're done, it just tells you, okay, that's it. I'm going to take a little bit of my light blue permanent and add just a very small highlight right here, just to balance this out and put a little more contrast from the warm gold and then some nice cool blue. I'm just using my thumb to drag that paint down and blend it into the canvas a little bit. There we go. Happy painting, everybody. Have so much fun painting your beautiful moonlit lily pad lagoon. And when you're completed your painting, just to remind you to take down your creation bubble. Just by washing gold light through your bubble, disconnecting from your upper grounding, and then watching the bubble collapse into your grounding cord, into the earth. With so much gratitude to Mother Earth for holding you. Have fun painting. Sending you all so much love. Mwah.